The beginnings of Margaret Thornton's legacy. Margaret Thornton was seated in a plush armchair by the bay window of the Thornton estate, sipping her afternoon tea with the air of a woman who had lived many lives. The soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock echoed through the expansive room, blending with the faint chirping of birds outside. The estate's sprawling gardens, dotted with marble statues and manicured hedges, were a testament to Margaret's impeccable taste and her family's wealth that had spanned generations. At 93, Margaret's body might have been fragile, her once strong hands now gnarled by arthritis, and her steps unsteady, but her mind was sharp as ever. Her blue eyes sparkled with the same intensity that had once commanded attention in the grand ballrooms of London, Paris, and New York. She was, after all, Margaret Thornton, the formidable matriarch of the Thornton family, a name synonymous with power, wealth, and social standing. Born into privilege, Margaret had been raised in a world of refined luxury. She had attended the finest schools, met royalty, and brushed shoulders with the titans of industry. Her parents had instilled in her a strong sense of duty, not just to her family, but to society as a whole. The Thornton legacy was not only built on financial success, but also on philanthropy. Hospitals, schools, and orphanages bore the family name, and Margaret had always believed that with great wealth came great responsibility. She married Robert Thornton, a successful businessman whose empire spanned across industries, from oil to real estate. Their union had been one of love and mutual respect, but also one of strategy. Together, they had built an even greater fortune, one that had become the cornerstone of their family's influence in society. When Robert passed away 2 decades ago, Margaret took the reins of the family business, surprising many with her shrewdness and tenacity. Under her leadership, the Thornton family fortune not only grew but diversified into new industries. But now, as Margaret sat in the twilight of her years, she found herself facing a profound sense of betrayal, abandonment, and a deep loneliness that no amount of wealth could cure. 6 months ago, her only son, Charles, had convinced her to move into Sunnybrook Manor, an exclusive nursing home tucked away in the quiet countryside. At first, Margaret had resisted. She loved her estate, her gardens, her independence. But Charles had been persistent, his arguments cloaked in concern for her safety and health. "You're not getting any younger, Mother," Charles had said with that familiar tone of authority. "The estate is too big for you now, and I worry about you being alone. Sunnybrook will give you the care and attention you need." Margaret had eventually relented, her son's pleas convincing her that perhaps it was time to accept her limitations. She had packed a few cherished belongings, and with a heavy heart, moved into the nursing home. But it hadn't taken long for her to realize that Charles's motivations were not as pure as they seemed. Sunnybrook was beautiful, yes, a pristine facility with manicured lawns, well-dressed staff, and residents who had once occupied the same social circles as Margaret. But it wasn't her home. The rooms, though elegantly furnished, felt cold and sterile. The conversations with other residents, though polite, lacked the depth and warmth of true friendship. The staff was attentive, but there was an underlying detachment in their interactions, as if they were performing their duties out of obligation rather than genuine care. Margaret's sense of abandonment grew with each passing day. Charles rarely visited, always citing his busy schedule with the family business. Her grandchildren, whom she had doted on for years, were nowhere to be seen. Birthdays and holidays passed with only perfunctory phone calls or hastily written cards. The loneliness, once a dull ache, became a constant companion. It was during one of her many sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling of her too-perfect room in Sunnybrook, that Margaret began to piece together the truth. Charles wasn't concerned about her well-being. He was concerned about her wealth. He had placed her in this gilded cage not out of love, but out of greed. He wanted control of the family fortune, and by isolating her in Sunnybrook, he had effectively removed her from the decision-making process. The realization cut deep, but it also ignited a fire within Margaret that had long lain dormant. She might have been old and frail, but she wasn't powerless. Not yet. One crisp autumn morning, as the first golden leaves began to fall outside her window, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She reached for the phone on her bedside table and dialed the number of her longtime lawyer, Andrew Billings. "Andrew, it's Margaret," she said, her voice steady but laced with determination. "I need to make some changes to my will, and I need it done quietly." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Andrew spoke. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton. What exactly do you have in mind?" Margaret smiled to herself as she gazed out the window, the vibrant colors of the garden below mirroring the vibrant resolve in her heart. "It's time to teach my family a lesson they won't soon forget." Over the next several weeks, Margaret meticulously crafted a new plan for her estate and her wealth. She consulted with Andrew daily, reviewing documents, discussing legal loopholes, and ensuring that every detail was ironclad. She was no stranger to complex negotiations, and she approached this new task with the same strategic mind that had once built empires. Margaret decided that her fortune would not simply be handed down to her son and grandchildren as they likely expected. Instead, she would make sure that her wealth served a greater purpose, a purpose that would resonate far beyond the confines of her family's interests. She had spent a lifetime building the family legacy, but now, in her final years, she wanted to build something that would leave a mark on the world, something far more valuable than money. She decided that a significant portion of her estate would go to causes she had long supported: hospitals, education, and most importantly, elder care. After all, she had come to understand firsthand the plight of the elderly, who were too often cast aside and forgotten, even by their own families. It was time to change that. But Margaret wasn't done with her family. She had one final, bold move in mind. She would leave them something, but it would come with strings attached. Strings that would force them to confront their own values and priorities. She wanted them to understand that wealth was not the ultimate goal, that it meant nothing without compassion, responsibility, and love. If they could not learn that lesson, then they would have no part in her legacy. As Margaret finalized her plans, she felt a sense of peace wash over her for the first time in months. She might be physically frail, but she was still the matriarch of the Thornton family. And with this last act, she would ensure that her legacy would live on, not just in the wealth she had amassed, but in the lives she touched and the lessons she imparted. Her family might have thought they had written the final chapter of her story, but Margaret Thornton was far from done. She had one more move to make, and it would be one that no one, least of all Charles, would see coming. The day of reckoning was near, and Margaret was ready to face it head-on. And so, the stage was set for Margaret's ultimate plan to unfold, a plan that would challenge her family's greed, reshape their values, and leave a legacy that would extend far beyond the halls of Sunnybrook Manor. The seeds of revolution. The air was heavy with tension on the day Margaret Thornton's family finally came to visit her at Sunnybrook Manor. For 6 long months, Margaret had waited, hoped, even, for a sign of care or concern from her son Charles and his family. But as the months passed, their absence confirmed what she had already suspected. She had been conveniently tucked away, out of sight, to let Charles continue his life without the inconvenience of an aging mother. Margaret had spent the time in contemplation, sharpening her resolve. She knew she was not just another old woman abandoned to the hands of caregivers. She was Margaret Thornton, and her mind was still a force to be reckoned with. She had used that force over the past weeks, quietly orchestrating a plan that would bring her family to their knees, not for revenge, but to teach them a lesson they sorely needed to learn. The morning of the visit, Margaret sat by the same bay window where she had often stared out at the manicured gardens, the vibrant colors of autumn slowly giving way to the muted tones of winter. A soft knock at her door signaled the arrival of a nurse with her morning medications, but Margaret waved her off with a firm hand. "No need for those today, thank you," she said, her voice resolute. The nurse hesitated. "But Mrs. Thornton," Dr. Miller said. "I'll take them later," Margaret cut her off, her tone leaving no room for argument. She had more important matters to focus on today. She needed her mind clear, her senses sharp. The medication dulled her, made her feel sluggish. Today, of all days, she needed to be fully present. The clock struck 2 in the afternoon, and just as expected, a knock sounded at her door once again. This time, it wasn't a nurse. Margaret's heart gave a slight flutter, but she quickly stilled it, straightening in her wheelchair as she prepared herself for the confrontation she had been rehearsing for months. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door swung open, and there they were. Charles entered first, his tall frame filling the doorway with an air of authority that he had likely borrowed from his years in business. His neatly pressed suit and polished shoes screamed of wealth and power, though Margaret knew too well the insecurity that lingered beneath the surface. Behind him came Evelyn, his wife, dressed impeccably as always, her smile as tight and rehearsed as it had been in every gala Margaret had ever hosted. The grandchildren followed, Thomas, the eldest, with his brooding expression that Margaret recognized as boredom. Lily, always the pleaser, plastered on a smile but barely made eye contact. And Peter, the youngest, who stared at the ground as if the very floor held the answers to all of his problems. "Mother," Charles greeted her with a brief kiss on the cheek, which Margaret accepted without flinching. His warmth was manufactured, and she could feel it as plainly as the cool autumn air that wafted in through the window. "You're looking well." "Am I?" Margaret's voice held a hint of amusement. She clasped her hands in her lap, her gaze drifting over each of them. "It's good to see you all, finally." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice soft and sympathetic. "Margaret, we've been meaning to visit more often. It's just that things have been so busy." Margaret finished for her, raising a thin eyebrow. "I imagine running the company must be quite a burden." Charles stiffened at her remark. "We're managing just fine." Margaret nodded, letting silence stretch uncomfortably before speaking again. "I see. And what brings you all here today?" There was a pregnant pause, one that Margaret relished. She could see them exchanging glances, unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't the warm, doting grandmother they had expected to encounter. They were standing before the matriarch of the Thornton Empire, and they had forgotten who they were dealing with. "We wanted to see you, of course," Charles said, but the forced casualness in his voice betrayed his true intentions. He shifted in his seat before continuing. "But we've also been thinking, with everything going on, perhaps it's time to discuss the family trust." Ah, there it was. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had been waiting for this moment. "The trust," she echoed, feigning ignorance. "What about it?" Charles cleared his throat, his gaze sliding briefly toward Evelyn before he spoke again. "We're looking to expand the company, possibly into international markets. But we need additional capital to make it happen. We were hoping that perhaps you might consider releasing some funds from the trust." Margaret's smile didn't waver, but the warmth in her eyes disappeared. "You were hoping I might release some funds." She let the words hang in the air, savoring the discomfort that followed. "Mother, it's not just about the money," Charles hastily added, sensing her displeasure. "It's about the future of the family legacy. You've built something incredible, and we want to continue that, to grow it. But we need resources to do that." "The future of the family legacy," Margaret repeated slowly, as if testing the words on her tongue. She looked around at the faces of her family, the people who would one day inherit everything she had spent a lifetime building. Yet not one of them had asked how she was doing, how she was adjusting to life at Sunnybrook, how she felt about leaving behind the estate she had loved for so many years. "The family legacy," she said, her voice hardening. "Is that what this is about, Charles? Or is it about your inheritance?" A flicker of anger crossed Charles's face, but he quickly masked it. "Mother, that's not fair. We've always been committed to continuing what you and Father started." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And yet here I sit in a nursing home, while you've been running the company for the past 6 months without a single visit. Is that what commitment looks like to you?" Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but Margaret cut her off with a wave of her hand. "No, Evelyn. I don't want to hear your excuses. I've had plenty of time to think these past few months, and I've come to a few conclusions." The room fell into a tense silence, with the grandchildren shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wanting to be anywhere but here. Margaret's sharp eyes took them all in: Charles, Evelyn, Thomas, Lily, and Peter, and for the first time, she saw them not as her family, but as individuals who had forgotten what it meant to truly care for one another. "You see," Margaret began, her voice cool and measured, "I realize now that you don't see me as your mother or grandmother anymore. I'm just a means to an end for you. You've placed me here, out of sight, because you think I'm no longer useful. You think that if you wait long enough, I'll die quietly, and then you'll finally get what you've been waiting for all these years. That's not true." Charles protested, his voice rising in indignation. "Isn't it?" Margaret shot back, her eyes flashing with anger. "You've been so focused on the money, on the company, that you've forgotten the very foundation of this family. It wasn't built on greed or ambition. It was built on love, on responsibility. And you failed in both." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Margaret could see the flickers of guilt cross their faces, but it was too late for apologies, too late for empty promises. "Mother, please," Charles said, his tone now pleading. "We can fix this. We can." "No," Margaret interrupted sharply. "You won't fix anything, because you don't understand what's broken." She turned her wheelchair away from them, her gaze now focused out the window. "I think it's time for you to leave. I'm feeling rather tired." The finality of her words left no room for argument. One by one, they stood, unsure of what to say. Even Evelyn, who had always been quick with a platitude, seemed at a loss for words. As they filed out of the room, Charles lingered at the door. "Mother, about the trust," he began, but Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "You'll get nothing from me, Charles. Not a penny. Now, get out." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Margaret alone once again. She sat there, staring out at the garden, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. But she knew it had to be done. They had to learn that wealth was not the only thing of value in this world. Reaching for the phone beside her bed, she dialed Andrew Billings once more. "It's time," she said simply. "Put the final phase of the plan into action." As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. The die was cast, and her family would soon learn the true meaning of legacy, whether they liked it or not. Margaret sat quietly in her room, the autumn light casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the world continued as it always had, unaware that a storm was brewing. She had made her move, and now, all she had to do was wait. But Margaret was no longer waiting for her family's love or attention. She was waiting for them to understand the lesson she had tried to teach them all along. And by the time they realized what she had done, it would be too late. This was no longer about money or inheritance. This was about something far greater, the rebirth of the Thornton family, and the legacy of compassion and responsibility that Margaret was determined to leave behind. And so, the seeds of revolution were planted, and Margaret Thornton's final act was set in motion. The unraveling. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret Thornton's fateful confrontation with her family, and the aftermath of that meeting rippled silently through their lives, shaking their foundation like the tremors of an earthquake. At the Thornton mansion, once the hub of society's elite gatherings, Charles Thornton sat at his vast mahogany desk, staring blankly at the paperwork before him. His office, adorned with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling estate, felt oppressively small that day. His mind wasn't on the figures or reports scattered across the desk. It was on his mother's biting words, still echoing in his ears. "You'll get nothing from me. Not a penny." For the first time in his life, Charles felt vulnerable. His mother's cold dismissal had been unexpected, like a punch to the gut he hadn't seen coming. He had always known that Margaret was a formidable woman, but he had underestimated her. He had assumed that age had dulled her sharpness, that she was no longer the calculating matriarch she once was. But the steel in her eyes during that last meeting told him otherwise. She was still very much in control, and Charles realized, with a sinking feeling, that he wasn't. The letter from Andrew Billings, Margaret's attorney, arrived that morning. Charles's hand shook as he opened it, his pulse quickening. He knew it would confirm what he had dreaded since their meeting at Sunnybrook. Dear Mr. Thornton, in accordance with Mrs. Margaret Thornton's revised will, I am writing to inform you that significant changes have been made to the distribution of her estate. You, your wife, and your children will not inherit the estate in the manner you may have previously expected. Should you wish to discuss the matter in further detail, I recommend arranging a formal meeting at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, Andrew Billings. Charles felt the weight of the letter like an anvil pressing down on his chest. The implications were staggering. His mother hadn't just threatened to cut him off. She had actually done it. All those years of meticulously managing the Thornton family business, ensuring its growth and protecting its assets, seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. He crushed the letter in his hand and threw it across the room in frustration. The paper bounced off the wall and landed unceremoniously on the plush carpet. "Damn it, Mother," he muttered under his breath. "What have you done?" The following day, Charles found himself in the dimly lit office of Andrew Billings, a man whose loyalty to Margaret was as unwavering as the legal ironclad walls he had built around her will. The room smelled of old leather and aged wood, the kind of scent that clung to the offices of men who dealt with power and secrets for a living. Billings sat across from Charles, his face impassive as always. "Mr. Billings, this has to be some sort of mistake," Charles began, forcing his voice to remain steady, though the mounting panic was evident in his eyes. "My mother was clearly confused. You and I both know that she wouldn't have changed her will so drastically without discussing it with me first." Billings raised a single eyebrow, his gaze cold and clinical. "Mrs. Thornton was of sound mind when she made these changes, Mr. Thornton. I have the documentation, as well as medical evaluations that attest to her mental clarity at the time." Charles leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. "This is outrageous. She's cutting her own family out of everything. The business, the estate, the trust. What could she possibly be thinking?" For a long moment, Billings said nothing. He simply studied Charles with a piercing gaze, as though weighing the merit of explaining Margaret's reasoning to him. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your mother has not cut you out, Mr. Thornton. She has simply reallocated her assets in a way that reflects her values." Billings pulled a folder from his drawer, sliding it across the desk to Charles. "I believe this will answer some of your questions." Charles snatched the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside with mounting disbelief. There it was, spelled out in cold legal terms: his mother's wealth, her shares in the family business, the estate, the trust, all of it was being redirected. Charities, foundations, scholarships, causes she had always supported in the past, but now with unprecedented generosity. The company's control would be transferred to a board of trustees, with only a modest monthly stipend for Charles and Evelyn, enough to ensure they lived comfortably, but without the extravagance they were accustomed to. And then there was the part about the grandchildren. Each of them would receive a substantial inheritance, but only after completing 5 years of community service. The terms were clear. They had to work with the elderly or underserved communities before they would see a single penny of their inheritance. Charles felt his pulse quicken. 5 years of community service. For his children. What kind of cruel test was this? "This is ridiculous," Charles snapped, slamming the folder shut. "My mother can't do this. This isn't how the Thornton legacy is supposed to be managed. She's giving everything away to strangers." "Not strangers, Mr. Thornton," Billings said calmly. "She's giving it to causes she believes in. Causes that, in her words, reflect the true spirit of the Thornton legacy." Charles felt his throat tighten, his anger boiling over. What about the company? What about the future of our family? She's handing control of everything to outsiders. Billings adjusted his glasses, unflinching under Charles's growing fury. The Board of Trustees will manage the company, and I assure you, they are highly qualified. Your mother chose them carefully. You will retain your position as CEO, but you will answer to the board from now on. And should the company thrive under this new structure, you stand to benefit as well. But make no mistake, Mr. Thornton, this is no longer your sole domain. Charles stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. His mind was spinning, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. He thought about contesting the will, of hiring the most expensive lawyers he could find to fight it. Surely there was a loophole somewhere, some way to reverse the damage his mother had inflicted. But deep down, he knew Margaret had been too meticulous for that. She had outsmarted him, as she always did. Why? Charles muttered, more to himself than to Billings. Why would she do this? Billings's expression softened for the first time since Charles had entered the room. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. I believe your mother hoped to teach you all a lesson about the value of family, of responsibility, and of using wealth for something greater than personal gain. Charles's jaw clenched, his mind still grappling with the enormity of what his mother had done. His entire life had been built around the family business, the Thornton name, and the wealth that came with it. He had expected to pass that legacy down to his children, just as his father had passed it down to him. But Margaret had taken that vision and shattered it. No, Charles thought. She hadn't just shattered it. She had remade it, in her own image, with her own ideals, and he was powerless to stop her. Across town, Evelyn sat in the middle of her charity luncheon, frozen in shock as the call from Andrew Billings replayed in her mind. She stared blankly at the half-empty champagne flute in front of her, her fingers gripping the glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The luncheon, which had once been the highlight of Evelyn's social calendar, now felt like a hollow farce. The women around her were chatting animatedly about their latest fundraisers and gala events, their laughter echoing off the grand marble walls of the event hall. But Evelyn heard none of it. Her world had come crashing down in the span of a single phone call. The monthly allowance, the community service requirement for the children, the loss of control over the estate and the company. It was unthinkable. How had things gone so terribly wrong? Evelyn prided herself on maintaining an impeccable image, the perfect wife, mother, and philanthropist. She had spent years cultivating her role in society, attending the right events, rubbing shoulders with the right people. But beneath the polished exterior, Evelyn had always known that her influence, her social standing, her very identity, was tied to the Thornton name and fortune. Without that wealth, who was she? The thought terrified her. She excused herself from the table, ignoring the curious glances from her friends as she hurried to the restroom. Once inside, Evelyn locked the door and leaned against the cool tile wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Could they fight this? Could they find a way to convince Margaret to reverse her decision? Surely, Charles would have a plan. He always did. But even as the thoughts ran through her mind, Evelyn knew there was no easy solution. Margaret had already set everything in motion. And Margaret never made idle threats. Evelyn's hands shook as she pulled her phone from her purse and dialed Charles's number. It rang twice before he answered. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," came Charles's terse reply. "I just met with Billings. This is worse than we thought." Evelyn swallowed hard. What are we going to do? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know," Charles admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. "But we're not going to let her win." As Evelyn ended the call, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her perfectly styled hair, her flawless makeup, the designer dress that had cost more than some people made in a month. It all felt meaningless now. The life she had built, The identity she had so carefully crafted was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Meanwhile, across the country, Margaret's grandchildren were experiencing their own reckoning. Emails from Andrew Billings had arrived in their inboxes, detailing the conditions of their inheritances, and the reactions were as varied as their personalities. Thomas, the eldest, sat in his dorm room at a prestigious Ivy League university, staring at the email in disbelief. 5 years of community service, working with the elderly. Thomas had never set foot in a nursing home, let alone worked in one. His life was mapped out. Graduation, a high-paying job in finance, followed by a life of luxury and success. But now, his grandmother had thrown a wrench into those plans. He had expected to step into the family fortune with ease, but instead, she was asking him to, what? Volunteer. Give up 5 years of his life to some charity work. It was absurd. Lily, the middle grandchild, had a different reaction. While she, too, was shocked by the terms of the will, there was a part of her that felt curious. She had always felt like an outsider in the Thornton family, more interested in art and creativity than in business or wealth. The idea of doing community service didn't scare her as much as it intrigued her. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to be learned from this. Peter, the youngest, reacted with anger. He had always been the rebellious one, the child who questioned authority and pushed boundaries. The idea that his inheritance was now tied to a condition he had no interest in fulfilling enraged him. Who was his grandmother to dictate how he lived his life? He didn't need her money. He would find a way to make it on his own. Or so he told himself. As the Thornton family members grappled with the shock of Margaret's decision, the seeds of rebellion, resentment, and introspection began to take root. Each of them faced a choice: fight the new reality or adapt to it. But one thing was clear. Margaret Thornton had set a plan in motion that none of them had anticipated. And as the days passed, they would come to realize that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would force them to confront not only their own values, but the true meaning of legacy. Margaret had known exactly what she was doing. Margaret's legacy in motion. The news of Margaret Thornton's radical will reverberated beyond the Thornton family, sending shockwaves through the upper echelons of the business world, high society, and even the quiet halls of Sunnybrook Manor. What had started as a personal family matter had begun to evolve into something much larger, an unfolding drama that would affect not only the Thorntons, but also the very foundations of the world they lived in. Margaret, meanwhile, sat quietly in her sunlit room at Sunnybrook, watching the ripples spread. Her heart ached, of course, despite the steely determination she had shown to her family. She was still a mother and a grandmother, but she knew that what she had done was necessary. The decisions she had made weren't about retribution, they were about transformation. Still, she could feel the weight of it all bearing down on her as the days passed. The letters and calls from lawyers, the media's growing interest in her story, the whispers of scandal in her social circles, it was exhausting. Margaret was accustomed to navigating high-stakes negotiations and tough decisions, but this was different. This was personal. Yet, she held fast to her resolve, knowing that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the harshest lessons. One bright afternoon, Margaret received a visitor who would prove to be the catalyst for what was about to unfold. Her old friend and confidant, Sarah Hawthorne, came to see her, carrying with her the air of an old aristocrat who had never quite relinquished the grace and poise of her younger days. Sarah, though nearly Margaret's age, still moved with a dignified purpose, her pearl earrings catching the light as she leaned down to kiss Margaret on the cheek. "My dear Margaret," Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with affection, "you've certainly stirred up quite the storm." Margaret smiled faintly, gesturing for Sarah to sit in the armchair by the window. "I've always liked the quiet before a storm," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "It gives you time to think." Sarah chuckled. "Well, you've certainly given everyone plenty to think about. The entire city's buzzing with talk of your will, and I've heard the boardrooms are in chaos. Your Charles must be beside himself. He'll adjust," Margaret said coolly, though a twinge of sadness flickered in her chest. "He always does." Sarah studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching Margaret's face. "You're a brave woman, Margaret. It's not easy to upend everything you've built. But I think you're right. You've given them a chance to grow. They just don't realize it yet." "I hope so," Margaret replied, her gaze drifting out the window. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the garden. "But it's not just about them, Sarah. It's about all of us. It's about the world we've built. And the one we've forgotten." Sarah nodded, understanding. "The elderly." "Yes," Margaret said, her voice softening. "People like us. We've spent our lives building fortunes, raising families, making decisions, and now we're cast aside, as if we no longer have anything to offer. I want to change that." And that was when the idea truly crystallized. Over the next hour, as Margaret and Sarah talked, the vision for something much larger than personal transformation began to take shape. Margaret had always been philanthropic. Her name was etched on the wings of hospitals. Her donations funded scholarships and research programs. But this was different. This was a mission born not of obligation, but of experience. She had lived it. She had felt the sting of abandonment, of being seen as obsolete. And now she was determined to make sure that no one else felt that way again. The next morning, Margaret made another call to Andrew Billings, her lawyer and trusted advisor. But this time, she wasn't discussing the intricacies of her will. This time, she had a new plan. "Andrew," she said, her voice resolute, "I want to start a foundation. One that focuses on elder care and community engagement. And I want to use my remaining wealth to do it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, as if Andrew was processing the gravity of what she was proposing. "A foundation," he finally said. "You mean a charity organization?" "No," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Not just a charity. I want to create something that changes the way we think about aging. I want to build a network of programs that ensure the elderly are cared for, respected, and valued. And I want to involve the next generation. This isn't about giving handouts, Andrew. This is about creating a legacy that lasts." Andrew, ever the professional, responded quickly. "I'll start drawing up the paperwork." "But Margaret, this will require significant funds. Are you sure about this? You're talking about a substantial portion of your remaining wealth." Margaret smiled to herself, her mind already made up. "I've never been more sure of anything." And just like that, the Thornton Foundation for Dignified Aging was born. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Margaret's decisions were beginning to hit her family in full force. Charles had been in constant meetings for days, trying to steady the ship that his mother had so dramatically rocked. The board of trustees, handpicked by Margaret, had already begun exerting their influence, challenging his decisions, questioning his strategies. For the first time in his career, Charles was being forced to answer to someone other than himself, and he didn't like it. But it wasn't just the business that was unraveling. His home life was also in disarray. Evelyn, normally the epitome of grace and composure, had become increasingly distant, retreating into herself as she grappled with the reality of their new financial situation. The luxurious lifestyle that they had become accustomed to was now under threat, and Evelyn wasn't sure how to cope. Their children, too, were feeling the pressure. Thomas, the eldest, had tried to brush off the community service requirement at first, dismissing it as a trivial inconvenience. But as the days passed, the reality of his situation sank in. Without fulfilling his grandmother's conditions, he would inherit nothing. And without that inheritance, his carefully planned future in finance was uncertain. The thought of spending 5 years working with the elderly, a group he had rarely interacted with, was both foreign and daunting. Lily, on the other hand, found herself surprisingly intrigued by the challenge. She had always been different from her brother, more introspective, more connected to the world around her. The idea of giving back, of finding meaning in something beyond wealth and status, resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. She began researching volunteer opportunities, quietly exploring ways to fulfill her grandmother's wishes. Peter, the youngest, was furious. He had never been one to follow rules or conform to expectations, and the idea that his inheritance was contingent on something so restrictive enraged him. He spent his days locked in his room, plotting ways to circumvent the conditions of the will. In his mind, his grandmother's actions were nothing short of a betrayal. But despite their differing reactions, one thing was clear. Their grandmother had set them on a path none of them had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's foundation quickly gained momentum. The initial announcement sent ripples through the philanthropic community, and soon, people were reaching out from all corners of society. Business leaders, healthcare professionals, even politicians, offering their support. Margaret had touched a nerve. The issue of elder care, long overlooked, was finally being brought into the spotlight. Margaret, with the help of Andrew Billings and a team of dedicated professionals, began laying the groundwork for the Foundation's initiatives. The Thornton Foundation for Dignified Aging would focus on 3 core areas: improving the quality of care in nursing homes, providing support and resources for families caring for elderly relatives, and creating intergenerational programs that would bridge the gap between the young and the old. One of the Foundation's first projects was to transform Sunnybrook Manor into a model facility for elder care. Margaret had already made significant donations to the home, but now, with the Foundation's backing, Sunnybrook was about to undergo a complete transformation. The staff would receive additional training, new programs would be introduced to engage the residents, and state-of-the-art facilities would be installed to ensure that the elderly residents lived with dignity and comfort. But Margaret wasn't stopping there. She wanted to create a network of care homes across the country, places where the elderly would be treated not as burdens, but as valuable members of society with rich experiences and wisdom to share. She envisioned a future where nursing homes were no longer seen as places of abandonment, but as vibrant communities where people of all ages could come together to learn, grow, and support one another. And Margaret was determined to make that vision a reality. As the Foundation gained traction, the media took notice. Reporters began calling, requesting interviews with the woman who had upended her family's fortune in favor of a cause that resonated with so many. Margaret, ever the savvy public figure, agreed to a select few interviews, knowing that the more attention the Foundation received, the greater its impact could be. One interview, in particular, stood out. Elena Ramirez, an investigative journalist known for her hard-hitting exposes on social justice issues, had been following Margaret's story closely. Elena had spent years covering the neglect and abuse rampant in nursing homes across the country, and when she heard about the Thornton Foundation's mission, she knew she had to get the full story. She sat across from Margaret in the sunlit room at Sunnybrook, her notepad in hand, and began the interview. "Mrs. Thornton," Elena began, her voice steady but curious, "you've made some radical changes in your will, changes that have shocked not only your family but the entire business world. What prompted you to take such drastic action?" Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes thoughtful as she considered the question. "I suppose it wasn't so much a decision as it was a realization," she said softly. "I realized that the legacy I was leaving behind wasn't the one I wanted. I've spent my life building wealth, but in the end, what does that mean if it doesn't serve a greater purpose? I want to leave behind something more than money. I want to leave behind a world that values its elders, that cares for the people who have lived and loved and contributed so much." Elena nodded, scribbling furiously in her notepad. "And your family? How have they reacted to this new direction?" Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "They'll learn," she said simply. "I've given them the opportunity to grow. Whether they take it or not, that's up to them." Elena pressed on, her eyes narrowing. "But do you worry that your decisions will create resentment, that they might feel you've abandoned them?" Margaret paused, her gaze drifting out the window once more. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "They may feel that way now," she said, "but I believe in time they'll come to understand. Love isn't always about giving people what they want. Sometimes it's about giving them what they need." And with those words, Margaret Thornton cemented her place as not just a matriarch, but as a woman determined to reshape the world in her final years. Her family might have seen her actions as betrayal, but Margaret knew better. She was creating something far greater than a simple inheritance. She was creating a legacy of compassion, purpose, and dignity. A legacy that, whether her family realized it or not, would change them all for the better. But even as Margaret's plans unfolded, forces were gathering that would soon challenge everything she had built. The Thornton family was not the only group struggling with her decision. Powerful figures in business and politics, some of whom stood to lose from the changes she was advocating, were quietly preparing their own moves. And Margaret, though sharp and resolute, was about to discover that not all battles can be fought with strategy alone. The real test of her legacy was about to begin. A storm of resistance. Margaret Thornton sat by her window at Sunnybrook Manor, gazing out at the once familiar, yet ever-changing gardens. The transformation of the nursing home had begun. New programs were being implemented. The staff was more engaged, and residents were starting to feel the effects of Margaret's vision for dignified aging. The quiet hallways were now filled with life, and there was a sense of hope in the air that hadn't existed before. But while things at Sunnybrook were moving in the right direction, the same could not be said for the world outside. Margaret had anticipated resistance from her family, but she had underestimated the scale of opposition that would emerge from those whose interests were tied to the status quo. Wealthy businesspeople, politicians, and even some within the healthcare industry were growing wary of the attention Margaret's foundation was bringing to elder care reform. As her influence grew, so did the pushback from powerful forces who had no interest in seeing the industry change. It began subtly at first. Whispers in high society about Margaret's mental state, rumors about her motivations. These weren't the idle gossip of jealous socialites. They were calculated attacks meant to undermine her credibility. Invitations to the exclusive charity galas she had once graced with her presence began to dwindle. Her name was quietly removed from the boards of several prominent organizations she had supported for years. And then came the financial pressure. Longtime donors to her charitable causes began pulling out, their loyalty swayed by well-placed doubts about the soundness of her decisions. But Margaret was no stranger to the tactics of the powerful. She had lived her entire life in their world, and she recognized their maneuvers for what they were: an attempt to protect their interests. The elder care industry, much like other sectors, was driven by profit. And Margaret's growing influence, her push for greater oversight, improved conditions, and higher standards, threatened to disrupt that profitability. Yet, Margaret wasn't about to be intimidated. The mission she had set for herself went beyond her family and beyond her personal legacy. It had become a fight for the dignity of millions. She had already reshaped her family's future. Now she would take on an entire industry if she had to. One of the first signs of open resistance came in the form of an article in a prominent financial newspaper. The headline read, "Margaret Thornton's Reckless Vision. Can one woman's personal vendetta derail an industry?" The article was scathing, painting Margaret as an elderly woman out of touch with reality, driven by a desire to control her family and destroy the industry that had supported her fortune for decades. It questioned her mental stability, cited anonymous sources from within her own social circles, and warned that her reforms would bankrupt nursing homes and leave countless elderly people without care. The article was widely circulated, and its implications were clear. Those with vested interests were not going to sit idly by while Margaret tried to upend their world. That evening, as Margaret sat in her room reading the article, a deep sense of frustration settled over her. She had expected resistance, but the personal attacks stung more than she had anticipated. She had always prided herself on her reputation, a woman of impeccable character, a leader in business and philanthropy. Now that reputation was being used against her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret looked up to see Charles standing in the doorway. His face was drawn, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that Margaret hadn't seen before. It was the first time he had visited her since their confrontation weeks earlier, and she could tell from the way he stood that this was no social call. "Mother," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." Margaret nodded, gesturing for him to sit. There was a long silence between them as Charles took his seat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You've seen the article," Charles said, his voice flat. "I have," Margaret replied calmly, "and I'm sure it won't be the last." Charles sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Mother, this is getting out of control. The board is furious. Our investors are worried. And now, with this media attention—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "You're putting everything at risk." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly do you think I'm putting at risk, Charles?" "The company," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Our family. Everything we've built. You've alienated key donors. You've got politicians and business leaders turning against you. And now they're starting to question my leadership. I'm being pressured to distance myself from you, to step down as CEO and let the board take full control." Margaret regarded her son with a measured gaze. She could see the strain on his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But she also saw something else. Fear, not just fear of losing the company, but fear of losing his identity, his place in the world. "I understand your concerns, Charles," Margaret said quietly. "But what you're asking me to do is abandon the very cause I've committed myself to. The foundation, the reforms. It's not about me. It's about something much bigger." Charles shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You're turning this into a crusade, Mother. And for what? To prove a point. To punish us." Margaret's gaze hardened, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "This was never about punishment, Charles. This is about responsibility. Responsibility to the people who are suffering, who are being forgotten, while the rest of us enjoy our wealth and comfort. Do you know what it feels like to be discarded, to be treated as if your life no longer matters because you've grown old?" Charles looked away, his jaw clenched. He didn't have an answer. And Margaret knew he couldn't understand. Not yet, at least. "I built this company with your father," Margaret continued, her voice steady. "But it was never just about making money. It was about creating something that would last, something that would make a difference. And that's exactly what I'm doing now." Charles stood abruptly, pacing the room. "But you're doing it at the expense of everything else," he said, his voice rising. "The company is on the verge of collapse. Do you understand that? The board is ready to push me out. Our investors are losing confidence, and all because of this foundation you've started." Margaret watched her son carefully, her heart heavy with the knowledge that he still didn't see the bigger picture. "If the company collapses because we've chosen to do the right thing, then perhaps it deserves to collapse," she said firmly. "But I don't believe that will happen. I believe we can do both, run a successful business, and care for those who need it most." Charles stopped pacing, turning to face her with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're asking too much, Mother. You're asking me to choose between the company and you." Margaret's expression softened, a flicker of sadness passing over her face. "No, Charles. I'm asking you to choose between doing what's right and doing what's easy." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Charles stood there for a moment, his eyes searching his mother's face for some sign of compromise, some indication that she would back down. But Margaret's resolve was as unyielding as ever. Without another word, Charles turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Margaret sat there, staring at the door for a long time after he had gone, her mind heavy with the knowledge that the fight ahead would be even harder than she had anticipated. As the media storm grew, Margaret found an unlikely ally in Elena Ramirez, the investigative journalist who had first interviewed her about the foundation. Elena, with her sharp wit and unrelenting passion for justice, had become increasingly invested in the issue of elder care reform. She had witnessed firsthand the neglect and abuse in nursing homes, and Margaret's fight had ignited something in her. Elena's articles on the Thornton Foundation had gained widespread attention, and she had begun receiving letters and emails from people across the country. Families struggling to care for their elderly relatives, nursing home staff working under unbearable conditions, elderly individuals who felt forgotten and discarded. The stories were heartbreaking, but they also fueled Elena's determination to keep the issue in the spotlight. One evening, Elena visited Margaret at Sunnybrook, carrying with her a stack of letters from readers. As they sat together in Margaret's room, Elena spread the letters out on the table, her eyes alight with excitement. "You've started something, Margaret," Elena said, her voice filled with admiration. "People are paying attention. They're talking about this in a way they haven't before. The media is picking it up. Politicians are starting to take notice. This is bigger than you or your family now." Margaret smiled faintly, reaching out to pick up one of the letters. It was from a woman in her 60s, writing about her mother's experience in a poorly run nursing home. The letter was filled with gratitude for the work Margaret was doing, but also with a plea for help, for change. "It's always been bigger than me," Margaret said softly, her eyes scanning the words on the page. "I just hope we can make the changes in time." Elena leaned forward, her expression serious. "We will. But there's something you need to know. The opposition is getting stronger. I've heard whispers. Lobbyists for the nursing home industry are pushing back hard against your reforms. They're pouring money into campaigns, into politicians' pockets, trying to shut this down before it gets any bigger." Margaret nodded, her face calm but resolute. "I expected as much. But we're not stopping." "No," Elena agreed. "We're not. But we need to be smart about this. You've already done so much, but if we're going to win this fight, we need more than just media attention. We need political allies. We need public support." Margaret looked out the window, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had spent her life navigating the corridors of power, and now she would have to draw on every ounce of that experience. But she also knew that this battle would be different. This wasn't about securing wealth or influence. This was about something far more important. "Then we'll get them," Margaret said finally, her voice steady with determination. "We'll get the public behind us. We'll get the politicians. We'll get the families who have suffered, the caregivers who have been overworked and underpaid. We'll get everyone who believes that the way we treat our elderly is a reflection of who we are as a society." Elena nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. "We're going to need all the help we can get. But I believe in this, Margaret. I believe in you." As the two women sat together in the growing twilight, a sense of purpose filled the room. They both knew the battle ahead would be long and difficult. They also knew that they had the power to change the world, one small step at a time. While Margaret was preparing to take her fight to the public, the forces opposing her were gathering their own resources. Jonathan Graves, CEO of a powerful nursing home conglomerate, had been watching Margaret's rise with growing concern. Graves was a ruthless businessman, and he had no intention of allowing Margaret's reforms to cut into his profits. Graves and his team of lobbyists began a campaign to discredit Margaret, pouring money into ads that painted her as a well-meaning but misguided old woman, out of touch with the realities of the industry. They funded studies that claimed her reforms would bankrupt nursing homes, leaving thousands of elderly people without care. They called in favors with politicians, urging them to oppose the new regulations Margaret was advocating for. Graves wasn't just playing defense, he was launching a full-scale attack. But Margaret was ready. With Elena by her side, she began to rally public support, reaching out to advocacy groups, organizing rallies, and working behind the scenes to build alliances with key political figures. She knew that this fight wasn't just about money or power. It was about justice, about making sure that no one, young or old, was ever treated as disposable. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. Margaret Thornton, at 94 years old, was about to take on some of the most powerful forces in the country. But as she sat in her quiet room at Sunnybrook, watching the sunset cast its golden glow over the gardens, she felt no fear. She had faced greater challenges in her life, and this, she knew, was her greatest legacy yet. Triumph and legacy. The weeks following Margaret Thornton's decision to confront the powerful forces aligned against her were a blur of activity, media attention, and strategy. The issue of elder care, once a topic relegated to the back pages of newspapers and late-night television reports, had become a national debate, and Margaret found herself at the center of it. As CEO Jonathan Graves and his allies pushed back harder, Margaret knew that this was no longer a personal fight. It was a battle for the future of how society treated its most vulnerable members. Margaret's life, which had once been quiet and contemplative at Sunnybrook Manor, had now become a flurry of meetings, phone calls, and public appearances. At 94, she was busier than ever, her mind as sharp and strategic as it had been when she'd led the family business to new heights decades ago. But this time, the stakes were different. She wasn't just managing a company, she was managing a movement. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in her office at Sunnybrook Manor, reviewing documents from the Foundation's latest initiatives, there was a knock at her door. It was Elena Ramirez, the journalist who had become her close ally and confidant during the course of this journey. Margaret waved her in, and Elena sat across from her, a serious expression on her face. "We've got a problem," Elena said, not wasting any time with pleasantries. Margaret raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "What kind of problem?" Elena sighed, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Graves is getting aggressive. His company is ramping up their attacks on you. They've started funding a nationwide campaign, commercials, online ads, newspaper articles, all aimed at discrediting the Foundation. They're trying to make it look like your reforms will bankrupt nursing homes and force them to close. They've even managed to get a few politicians to publicly speak out against the legislation you're pushing for." Margaret's face remained impassive, though a spark of frustration flickered in her eyes. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't fully anticipated the lengths Graves would go to protect his profits. Jonathan Graves wasn't just protecting his company. He was protecting an entire industry that had operated with impunity for far too long. He couldn't afford to let someone like Margaret come in and disrupt his carefully constructed empire. "They're scared," Margaret said calmly, folding her hands in her lap. "That's why they're escalating. They know they're losing control of the narrative." Elena nodded. "You're right. But we can't ignore this. Public opinion is starting to shift. Their campaign is working. People are worried. Nursing homes are essential for so many families, and Graves is capitalizing on that fear." Margaret took a deep breath, her mind racing through the options. She knew that this was a critical moment. If they didn't respond to Graves' attacks, everything they had worked for could be jeopardized. "Elena," Margaret said thoughtfully, "it's time to take this fight to the next level. We can't just defend ourselves against their lies. We need to go on the offensive." Elena's eyes lit up, sensing the direction Margaret was heading. "What do you have in mind?" Margaret smiled, the glint of the seasoned strategist returning to her eyes. "We're going to show the world exactly what's wrong with the current system, and we're going to show them how it can be better. Graves wants to paint us as radicals, as dreamers with no understanding of the industry. Let's prove him wrong." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret and Elena worked closely with their team of the Foundation, planning a series of public forums, town halls, and media events. They'd brought in experts, doctors, elder care advocates, even former nursing home workers, to speak about the real conditions in the industry. They invited families who had suffered under the current system to share their stories. And most importantly, they showcased the positive changes already underway at Sunnybrook Manor. One of the first events took place at a local community center, where Margaret stood before a packed audience, her wheelchair pushed to the side as she used a standing podium to address the crowd. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: seniors, caregivers, politicians, and concerned citizens. Cameras flashed as reporters took their places, eager to capture the words of the woman who had taken on an industry and was winning. Margaret began her speech quietly, her voice steady but full of conviction. "I'm not here today to vilify anyone," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm here to speak the truth, and the truth is that our elder care system is broken." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We've built a society that values productivity and youth, but we've forgotten that aging is a natural part of life. We've allowed our elderly to be warehoused in facilities that care more about profit than about people. We've allowed their voices to be silenced, their dignity to be stripped away. And I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on Margaret as she spoke. There was something about her presence, something commanding, yet compassionate, that drew people in. "I know what some of you might be thinking," she continued. "You're worried that these reforms will cost too much, that they'll bankrupt nursing homes or make it harder for families to care for their loved ones. But let me tell you, there is no cost too high when it comes to treating our elderly with the respect and dignity they deserve. And the changes we're proposing aren't just about spending more money. They're about prioritizing people over profits." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her passion clear. "We've already started to implement these changes here at Sunnybrook Manor. We've improved conditions, we've trained staff, we've created programs that engage the residents and make them feel valued. And do you know what's happened? Not only are the residents happier, but the staff is more motivated, the families are more involved, and the entire community has benefited." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Many in the room had seen the changes at Sunnybrook firsthand, and they knew Margaret was speaking the truth. "This is just the beginning," Margaret said, her eyes alight with determination. "But we need your help. We need to push back against the lies being spread by those who want to keep the system the way it is. We need to show the world that there is a better way. And together, we can make it happen." The room erupted in applause, and Margaret smiled as she stepped back from the podium. Elena was waiting for her at the side of the stage, her face glowing with pride. "That was incredible," Elena said as Margaret approached. "You've just won over half the room." Margaret chuckled softly. "Let's hope it's enough." As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's campaign gained momentum. Her speeches, combined with Elena's hard-hitting articles, began to shift public opinion in their favor. Families across the country started sharing their stories on social media, using the hashtag #DignityInAging, which quickly went viral. Advocacy groups joined the cause, and soon, the movement had grown beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Politicians, sensing the shift in the winds, began to take notice. Senator Lydia Chen, a rising star in the political arena, reached out to Margaret with a proposal. Chen had been quietly working on elder care reform for years, and she saw an opportunity to push for comprehensive legislation that would enforce higher standards for nursing homes, increase funding for community-based care, and provide support for families caring for elderly relatives. "We can make this a national issue," Senator Chen said during their first meeting. "You've already done the hard work of raising awareness. Now it's time to turn that awareness into action." Margaret agreed wholeheartedly. Together, they began drafting what would become known as the Thornton Elder Care Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that aimed to overhaul the elder care industry from top to bottom. The bill included provisions for stricter oversight, better working conditions for staff, and incentives for nursing homes that implemented innovative programs to improve quality of life for residents. But they knew that passing the bill wouldn't be easy. Graves and his allies were still fighting tooth and nail to stop them, pouring millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and attack ads. The fight had reached the halls of Congress, where the battle over elder care reform had become one of the most contentious issues on the legislative agenda. As the debate over the Thornton Elder Care Act raged on, Margaret's personal life continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Her family, still grappling with the consequences of her revised will, began to undergo their own transformations. Charles, after weeks of fighting the changes his mother had implemented at the family business, finally came to a realization. He had spent so much of his life chasing power, wealth, and control that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. His mother's unwavering conviction and the growing success of her foundation had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. One evening, Charles visited Margaret at Sunnybrook Manor, this time not to argue, but to apologize. He found his mother in the garden, her wheelchair parked near a bed of blooming roses. "Mother," he said quietly as he approached, "can we talk?" Margaret looked up, her expression unreadable, but she nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the bench beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the garden, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind, filling the space between them. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Charles began, his voice heavy with emotion. "About responsibility, about what it means to leave a legacy." Margaret said nothing, allowing him to continue. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to Father's expectations," Charles admitted. "Trying to prove that I could run the company, that I could be successful. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why we were doing it in the first place. I forgot that it wasn't just about making money. It was about something bigger." Margaret's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on her son's arm. "I'm sorry, Mother," Charles said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for not understanding, for not supporting you when you needed it most. You were right all along." Margaret smiled gently, her heart swelling with pride and relief. "It's never too late to learn, Charles. And it's never too late to make things right." Charles nodded, wiping away the tears that had formed in his eyes. "I want to help," he said firmly. "With the foundation, with the legislation. Whatever you need. I want to be a part of this." Margaret's smile widened, and for the first time in months, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her son, at long last, had come to understand the true meaning of legacy. As the Thornton family slowly began to heal, Margaret's grandchildren also found themselves undergoing profound changes. Thomas, the eldest, had initially resisted the community service requirement that came with his inheritance. But after volunteering at a local senior center for several months, he found himself unexpectedly drawn to the work. He had always been focused on his career in finance, but spending time with the elderly had opened his eyes to a different kind of fulfillment. He began to consider a career in nonprofit management, wanting to use his skills to help improve elder care facilities across the country. Lily, the middle child, threw herself into the art therapy program she had started at Sunnybrook Manor. She had always been the creative one in the family, and now she had found her calling. The residents loved her workshops, and soon other nursing homes were reaching out to her, asking for help in setting up similar programs. Lily's passion for art had found a new purpose, and she was more fulfilled than she had ever been. Peter, the youngest, had struggled the most with his grandmother's will. But after spending time working with technology companies to develop apps for seniors, he began to see the value in what Margaret had been trying to teach him. His rebellious nature had always made him resistant to authority, but now he was using that same energy to disrupt the tech industry in a positive way, creating tools that made life easier for the elderly and their caregivers. As Margaret watched her family grow and evolve, she felt a deep sense of pride. They had all learned the lesson she had hoped to teach them. The lesson that wealth was not the ultimate goal, but a tool to be used for the greater good. The day of the final vote on the Thornton Elder Care Act was one of the most nerve-wracking days of Margaret's life. She had fought harder than she ever imagined possible, and now it all came down to this. The halls of Congress were buzzing with anticipation, the debate having reached a fever pitch in the days leading up to the vote. Margaret watched from a special viewing room, surrounded by her family, Senator Chen and Alina. The tension in the room was palpable as the roll call began. One by one, the votes were cast, each aye or nay sending Margaret's heart racing. As the final votes were tallied, Margaret held her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Ayes 52. Nays 48. The Thornton Elder Care Act had passed. The room erupted into applause, and Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had done it. They had done it. The reforms she had fought so hard for were now law, and the lives of millions of elderly people across the country would be forever changed. Charles, Evelyn, and the grandchildren rushed to her side, their faces beaming with pride and joy. Margaret embraced each of them, her heart full as she realized that not only had she won the fight for elder care reform, but she had also won back her family. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the room emptied, Margaret sat alone by the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The weight of the past month's battles, both personal and political, settled over her, but it was a good weight, a weight of accomplishment, of purpose fulfilled. At 94 years old, Margaret Thornton had taken on an industry, challenged a system, and won. She had taught her family the true meaning of legacy and left behind a world that was better than the one she had inherited. And as she sat there, bathed in the soft glow of the city lights, Margaret knew that her work was done. Her legacy was secure.